I welcome you now to this story about the forest of Burzee, the nymphs, the great Ak, and most of all, about how Santa Claus came to be. Hi, I'm Glenda Cedarleaf, and I'm delighted to share this holiday story with you. So I invite you to become comfortable in the ways that you know best. Settling into your bed so you can simply relax as you listen to the story of the life and adventures of Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum. Once upon a time, so very long ago, there lived within the great forest of Burzee a wood nymph named Necile. Her hair was the color that lines a chestnut burr. Her eyes were blue in the sunlight and purple in the shade. Her cheeks bloomed with the faint pink that edges the clouds at sunset. She was closely related to the mighty Queen Zerline, and her home was beneath the shade of a wide-spreading oak. Necile's duties were few and simple. She kept weeds from growing beneath her trees and sapping the earth food required by her charges. In dry seasons, she carried water from the brooks and pools and moistened the roots of her thirsty dependents. One day, the great Ak visited the forest of Burzee, and he told the nymphs, "We live so happily, my fair ones, in our forest glades, that we know nothing of the sorrow and misery that fall to the lot of those poor mortals who inhabit the open spaces of the earth. They are not of our race, it is true. Sometimes these mortals abandon their babes at the edge of the forest. Maybe it's because they don't have enough food to support these children. Sometimes I feel so sorry for the children of these mortals that I step in to rescue them." When Necile heard this, she decided she'd go into the forest to see if she could find one of these human children. She wandered for several hours until eventually she found a baby lying in the grass, sweetly sleeping. Softly, she stole to the side of the babe, who was newborn, chubby and pink, and entirely helpless. While the nymph gazed, the infant opened its eyes and smiled upon her, stretching out two dimpled arms. And although she knew that the great Ak did not give her permission to do this, Necile picked up the child and brought the child home. When the great Ak found out, he said, "A nymph has defiled me in my laws, yet in my heart can I find no word of chiding." He told Necile, "You shall keep the babe, and I will give it my protection. But I warn everyone that this is the first time I have relaxed the law, and it shall be the last time. Nevermore to the end of the world shall a mortal be adopted by an immortal. Good night, my nymphs." And then Ak was gone from their midst, and Necile hurried away to rejoice over her newfound treasure. Soon, Necile's home was the most popular place in the forest. The nymphs clustered around her to see the child that lay asleep in her lap, with expressions of curiosity and delight. "What shall we call him, Necile?" "He must have a name." "Let him be called Klaus," answered Necile, "for that means little one." "Well, the queen said, let's call him Niklaus, for that will mean Necile's little one." The nymphs clapped their hands in delight, and Niklaus became the infant's name, although Necile loved best to call him Klaus. Necile gathered the softest moss in all the forest for Klaus to lie upon. She made his bed in her own home, and the little one flourished and grew big and sturdy day by day, while Necile taught him to speak, to walk, and to play. His thoughts and words were sweet and gentle, for the nymphs knew no evil, and their hearts were pure and loving. He became the pet of the forest, for Ox decree had forbidden beast or reptile to hurt him. He walked fearlessly wherever his goodwill guided him. Klaus looked upon the immortals who thronged around him with fearless eyes and smiling lips. He rode laughingly upon the shoulders of the merry Ryls. He mischievously pulled the gray beards of the low-browed Knooks. The Ryls loved the sound of his laughter, and the Knooks loved his courage. The fairies loved his innocence. The boy made friends with them all and learned to know their laws intimately. No forest flower was trampled beneath his feet, lest the friendly Ryls should be grieved. He never interfered with the beasts of the forest, lest his friends the Knooks should become angry. The fairies he loved dearly, but knowing nothing of mankind, he could not understand that he was the only one of his race living with them. To him, the forest was the world. He had no idea that millions of toiling, striving human creatures existed. He was happy and content. Years passed swiftly in Burzee. The nymphs have no need to regard time in any way. Even centuries make no change in the dainty creatures. Ever and ever they remain the same, immortal and unchanging. Klaus, however, being mortal, grew to manhood day by day. Necile was disturbed presently to find him too big to lie in her lap, and he had a desire for other food than milk. His stout legs carried him far into the forest of Burzee, where he gathered supplies of nuts and berries. The nymph who had come to love him dearly was puzzled to comprehend the changed nature of her charge, and unconsciously she changed her life to conform to his whims. She followed him readily through the forest paths. All the mysteries of the gigantic wood and the habits and the nature of the living things she would explain to him as they walked. And time passed on until one day the master woodsman came back to the forest of Burzee, and there he found sitting a broad-shouldered, stalwart youth who stood fully as high as the shoulder of the master himself. So he decided it was now time to take Klaus on a journey to see the world. With this news, Necile wept She had never cried in all of her life, but now she clung to the boy's neck as if she could not bear to let him go. Nonetheless, Och's mind was not changed, and he went forward in his plans to travel the world with Klaus. One morning, he came to get Klaus, brought him into a clearing in the forest, and said, "Place your hand upon my girdle and hold fast, while we journey through the air. For now shall we encircle the world and look upon many of the haunts of those men from whom you are descended." Klaus did what he was told, and soon they found themselves passing swiftly through the air at a great height. They could see buildings of many shapes and colors and the towns below them as they flew by. The master then said, "So long as you hold fast to my girdle, you will remain unseen by all mankind, though you will see them clearly. To release your grasp will be to separate yourself forever from me and your home in Burzee." One of the first laws of the forest is obedience, and Klaus had no thought of disobeying the master's wish. He clung fast to the girdle and remained invisible. They visited cities, and Klaus's sense of wonder grew, for now he was surrounded with creatures of his own kind for the first time in his life. Klaus looked earnestly upon his fellows. There were sad faces and happy faces, pleasant, kindly, and curious faces. But he especially noted the children, first curiously, then eagerly, and then lovingly. Ragged little ones rolled in the dust of the streets, playing with scraps and pebbles. Yet the children of the rich were not happier than those playing with the dust and pebbles, it seemed to Klaus. "Childhood is the time of man's greatest content," said Och, following the youth's thoughts. "'Tis during those years of innocent pleasure that the little ones are most free from care." "Tell me," said Klaus, "why do not all these babies fare alike?" "Because they're born in both cottage and palace," returned the master. "The difference in the wealth of the parents determines the lot of the child. Some are carefully tended and clothed in silks and dainty linen. Others are neglected and covered with rags. Yet all seem equally fair and sweet," said Klaus thoughtfully. "While they are babes, yes," agreed Och. "Their joy is in being alive, and they do not stop to think." Klaus was silent a moment, and then he asked, "Why was I reared in the forest among those who are not of my race?" Then Och, in a gentle voice, told him the story of his babyhood, how he had been abandoned at the forest's edge and left as prey for the wild beasts, and how the loving nymph Necile had rescued him and brought him to manhood under the protection of the immortals. "Yet I am not of them," said Klaus musingly. "You are not of them," returned the woodsman. "The nymph who cared for you as a mother seems now like a sister to you. By and by, when you grow old and gray, she will seem like a daughter. Yet another brief span, and you will be but a memory, while she remains Necile." "Then why, if man must perish, is he born?" demanded the boy. Everything perishes except the world itself and its keepers, answered Ak. But while life lasts, everything on earth has its use. The wise seek ways to be helpful to the world, for the helpful ones are sure to live again. Much of this Klaus failed to understand fully, but a longing seized him to become helpful to his fellows. And he remained grave and thoughtful while they resumed their journey. They visited many dwellings of men in many parts of the world, watching farmers toil in the fields, warriors dash into conflict, merchants exchanging their goods for bits of white and yellow metal. And everywhere, the eyes of Klaus sought out the children in love and pity. For the thought of his own helpless babyhood was strong within him, and he yearned to give help to the innocent little ones. And then, at last, they returned to the grand old forest of Berzee, where the master set Klaus down within the circle of nymphs, among whom the pretty Necile anxiously awaited him. But the brow of Klaus had become lined with deep thought, and only a few days passed before he announced to the nymphs, "I must leave you now, to take my part in the endless struggle to which humanity is doomed, and to live my life in my own way." "What will you do?" asked the queen gravely. "I must devote myself to the care of the children of mankind and try to make them happy," he answered. "Since your own tender care of a babe brought to me happiness and strength, thus will the memory of the loving nymph Necile be planted within the hearts of thousands of my race for many years to come, and her kindly act be recounted in song and in story, while the whole world shall last." "Have I spoken well, O Master?" "You have spoken well," returned Ak, and rising to his feet he continued, "Yet one thing must not be forgotten. Having been adopted as the child of the forest and the playfellow of the nymphs, you have gained a distinction which forever separates you from your kind. Therefore, when you go forth into the world of men, you shall retain the protection of the forest, and the powers you now enjoy will remain with you to assist you in your labors. In any need you may call upon the nymphs, the ryls, the knooks, and the fairies, and they will serve you gladly. I, the master woodsman of the world, have said it, and my word is the law." Klaus looked upon Ak with grateful eyes. "This will make me mighty among men," he replied, "protected by those kind friends, that I may be able to make thousands of little children happy. I will try very hard to do my duty, and I know the forest people will give me their support." "We will," said Fairy Queen earnestly. "We will," cried the merry ryls, laughing. "We will," shouted the crooked knooks, scowling. "We will," exclaimed the sweet nymphs proudly. But Necile said nothing. She only folded Klaus in her arms and kissed him tenderly. "The world is big," continued the boy, turning again to his loyal friends, "but men are everywhere. I shall begin my work near my friends, so that if I meet with misfortune, I can come to the forest for counsel or help." And with that, he gave them all a loving look and turned away. The sweet, wild life of the forest was over. It was time for him to go forth bravely. Coming through Berzee to its eastern edge, Klaus reached the laughing valley of Ho-Ha-Ho. On each side were rolling green hills, and a brook wandered midway between them to wind afar off beyond the valley. At his back was the grim forest. At the far end of the valley, a broad plain. The eyes of the young man, which had until now reflected his grave thoughts, became brighter as he stood silent, looking out upon the laughing valley. Then, on a sudden, his eyes twinkled, as stars do on a still night, and grew merry and wide. For at his feet, the cowslips and daisies smiled on him in friendly regard. The breeze whistled gaily as it passed by and fluttered the locks on his forehead. The brook laughed joyously as it leaped over the pebbles and swept around the green curves of its banks. The bees sang sweet songs as they flew from dandelion to daffodil. The beetles chirruped happily in the long grass, and the sunbeams glinted pleasantly over all the scene. "Here," cried Klaus, stretching out his arms as if to embrace the valley, "will I make my home." The valley was empty except for grass and the brook and the wildflowers and the bees and the butterflies. So Klaus decided to make his home there and live after the fashion of men. So he decided he needed to create a house. He got to work, finding tree trunks, making the logs, and eventually building his own home. And here in Laughing Valley he lived, and the spirit of happiness crept into his heart, and nevermore would the face of Klaus be clouded with anxieties. Nevermore would the trials of life weigh him down as with a burden. The Laughing Valley had claimed him for its own. The birds came sweeping into the valley at daybreak, and their song, so seldom heard in the deep wood, aroused Klaus. He rubbed the web of sleep from his eyelids and looked around. He eventually met the Knooks and the fairies and the Ryls. They taught him how to plow the earth and plant corn in the valley. They brought him food and warm blankets and clothing. And here in the Laughing Valley, Klaus loved his life, delighting in the favor and friendship of the immortals that had ministered to his every want. One day, Klaus knew it was time to venture across the valley and to the plain beyond, and eventually to reach the villages where the children lived. As he traveled to the villages, the youngsters came to know him. They knew his merry, laughing face and his kind glance of bright eyes. The parents, while they regarded the young man with some scorn for loving children more than their elders, were content that the girls and boys had found a playfellow who seemed willing to amuse them. So the children romped and played games with Klaus, and the boys rode upon his shoulders, and the girls nestled in his strong arms, and the babies clung fondly to his knees. Wherever the young man chanced to be, the sound of childish laughter followed him. And to understand this better, you must know that children were much neglected in those days and received little attention from their parents. so that it became to them a marvel that so goodly a man as Klaus devoted his time to making them happy. And those who knew him were, you may be sure, very happy indeed. One winter evening he picked up a stick of wood and began to cut it with his sharp knife. He had no thought at first except to just occupy his time. He whistled and sang to the cat and continued to carve away portions of the stick. And eventually, the wood began to have a shape, and the shape was like the head of a cat, with 2 ears sticking upward. Once he realized he had made a cat, he also realized that he had made his first toy. Back in Laughing Valley, snow had covered it like a white spread, and pillows of downy flakes drifted before the dwelling where Klaus sat, feeding the blaze of the fire. The brook gurgled on beneath a heavy sheet of ice, and all living plants and insects nestled close to Mother Earth to keep warm. The face of the moon was hid by dark clouds, and the wind, delighting in the wintry sport, pushed and whirled the snowflakes in so many directions that they could get no chance to fall to the ground. Klaus heard the wind whistling and shrieking in its play and thanked the good Nooks again for his comfortable shelter. Then, all of a sudden, Klaus heard a noise that sounded different from the voice of the wind. He stood up and listened, but the wind, growing boisterous, shook the door and rattled the windows to distract his attention. He waited until the wind was tired, and then, still listening, he heard once more. Quickly he drew on his coat, pulled his cap over his eyes, and opened the door. The wind dashed in and scattered the embers over the hearth. He went outside and peering anxiously into the darkness. The wind laughed and scolded and tried to push him over, but he stood firm. The helpless flakes stumbled against his eyes and dimmed his sight, but he rubbed them away and looked again. Snow was everywhere, white and glittering. It covered the earth and filled the air. The cry was not repeated. Klaus turned to go back into the house, but the wind caught him unawares and he stumbled and fell across a snowdrift. His hand plunged into the drift and touched something that was not snow. This he seized and, pulling it gently toward him, found it to be a child. The next moment he had lifted it into his arms and carried it into the house. The wind followed him through the door, but Klaus shut it out quickly. He laid the rescued child on the hearth and brushed away the snow, and he discovered it to be a Weekum, a little boy who lived in a house beyond the valley. Klaus wrapped a warm blanket around the little one and rubbed the frost from its limbs. Before long, the child opened his eyes and, seeing where he was, smiled happily. Then Klaus warmed milk and fed it to the boy slowly, while the cat looked on with sober curiosity. Finally, the little one curled up in his friend's arms and sighed and fell asleep. And Klaus, filled with gladness that he had found the wanderer, held him closely while he slumbered. The wind, finding no more mischief to do, climbed the hill and swept on towards the north. This gave the weary snowflakes time to settle down to earth, and the valley became still again. The boy, having slept well in the arms of his friend, opened his eyes and sat up. Then, as a child will, he looked around the room and saw all it contained. "How did you get lost in the storm, Weekum?" asked Klaus. "I started to walk to my auntie's house and lost my way," answered Weekum. "Were you frightened?" "It was cold," said Weekum, "and the snow got in my eyes so I could not see. Then I kept on till I fell in the snow without knowing where I was. And the wind blew the flakes over my head and covered me up." Klaus gently stroked his head, and the boy looked up at him and smiled. "I'm all right now," said Weekum. "Yes, you are safe, and in the morning I will carry you back to your mother." When morning came, the sun claimed the Laughing Valley and flooded it with his rays. So Klaus prepared to take the lost child back to his mother. The good woman wept tears of joy over the rescue of her darling and thanked Klaus many times for his kind act. So when he returned home, he carried a warm and happy heart back to the Laughing Valley. That night, he said to his cat, "I believe the children will love the wooden cats almost as well as the real ones, and they can't hurt them by pulling their tails and ears. I'll make another." And with that decision, Klaus had now begun his great work. He continued to make trips back to the village to check on the children. One day he found a poor hut near the walls of the beautiful palace of the Lord of Lurd. In the hut lay a little girl upon a wretched cot. She was moaning with pain. Klaus approached the child and kissed her and comforted her, and then he drew the toy cat from beneath his coat, where he had hidden it, and he placed it in her arms. Her eyes grew bright with pleasure. She hugged the kitty to her breast as if it were a precious gem. Her fever was quieted. The pain grew less and less, and she eventually fell into a sweet and refreshing sleep. Klaus laughed and whistled and sang all the way home. He felt very well paid for his labor, to know that he had brought happiness and healing to that little girl. Never had he been so happy as on that day. And in time, the winter was over, and all the Laughing Valley was filled with joyous excitement. The brook was so happy at being free once again that it gurgled more boisterously than ever and dashed so recklessly against the rocks, and it sent showers of spray high in the air. The grass thrust its sharp little blades upward through the mat of dead stalks, where it had hidden from the snow. The flowers were yet too timid to show themselves, although the riles were busy feeding their roots. The sun was in remarkably good humor and sent its rays dancing merrily throughout the valley. Klaus continued to carve cats, and then he decided to create other animals, a wooden rabbit and a lamb. The new toys pleased the children, and the fame of Klaus's playthings quickly spread to every cottage on plain and in village. He always carried his gifts to the sick children, for those who were strong enough walked to the house in the valley to ask for them. So a little path was soon worn from the plain to the door of the toy maker's cottage. The nooks selected for him clear pieces of soft wood, that his knife might not be blunted in cutting them. The Ryles kept him supplied with paints of all colors and brushes fashioned from the tips of timothy grasses. The fairies discovered that the workmen needed saws and chisels and hammers and nails and knives, and they brought Claus a good array of such tools. Klaus soon turned his living room into a most wonderful workshop. He built a bench before the window and arranged his tools and paints so that he could reach everything as he sat on his stool. And as he finished toy after toy to delight the hearts of little children, he found himself growing so happy that he could not refrain from singing and laughing and whistling all the day long. He went down to the brook to get clay so he could mold the clay into toys. There was no difficult task for him. Before he knew it, a baby doll was lying on the board and placed in the sun to dry. Then Klaus called the fairies and asked them to bring him colored silks with which to make a real dress for the clay image. The fairies set off at once on their errand, and before nightfall, they returned with a generous supply of silks and laces and golden threads. So now our Klaus had become a dressmaker as well as a toy maker. He cut the lavender silk and nearly sewed it into a beautiful gown that just fit the new dolly. He put a lace collar around its neck and pink silk shoes on its feet. The natural color of baked clay is a light gray, so Klaus painted the face to resemble the color of flesh, and he gave the dolly Bessie's brown eyes and golden hair and rosy cheeks. It was really a beautiful thing to look upon, and sure to bring joy to some childish heart. Remembering the time when he had journeyed with Ak through the world, Klaus knew children were everywhere, and he longed to make them as happy as possible with the gifts that he had created. So he loaded a great sack with all kinds of toys, slung it upon his back that he might carry it more easily, and started off on a longer trip than he had yet undertaken. Wherever he showed his merry face, in hamlet or in farmhouse, he received a cordial welcome, for his fame had spread into far lands. At each village the children swarmed about him, following his footsteps wherever he went. And the women thanked him gratefully for the joy he brought their little ones. And the men looked upon him curiously, that he should devote his time to such an occupation as toy making. But everyone smiled on him and gave him kindly words, and Klaus felt amply repaid for his long journey. When the sack was empty, he went back to the Laughing Valley and once more filled it to the brim. This time he followed another road into a different part of the country and carried happiness to many children who never before had owned a toy or guessed that such a delightful plaything even existed. After a third journey, so far away that Klaus was many days walking the distance, the store of toys became exhausted, and without delay he set about making a fresh supply. From seeing so many children and studying their tastes, he had acquired several new ideas about toys. The dollies were, he had found, the most delightful of all playthings for babies and little girls. So Klaus resolved to make many dolls of all sizes and to dress them in bright-colored clothing. The older boys, and even some of the girls, loved the images of animals. So he made cats, elephants, and horses. And many of the little fellows had musical natures and longed for drums and cymbals and whistles and horns. So he made a number of toy drums with tiny sticks to beat them with. And he made whistles from the willow trees and horns from the bog reeds and cymbals from bits of beaten metal. All this kept him busily at work, and before he realized it, the winter season came, with deeper snows than usual. And he knew he could not leave the valley with his heavy pack. So Klaus remained at his workbench, but he whistled and sang as merrily as ever, for he would allow no disappointment to sour his temper or make him unhappy. One bright morning he looked from his window and saw two of the deer he had known in the forest walking towards his house. Klaus was surprised, not that the friendly deer should visit him, but that they walked on the surface of the snow, as easily as if it were solid ground, notwithstanding the fact that throughout the valley the snow lay many feet deep. He had walked out of his house a day or two before and had sunk to his armpits in a drift. So, when the deer came near, he opened the door and called to them. "Good morning, Flossie. Tell me, how are you able to walk on the snow so easily?" "It is frozen hard," answered Flossie. "The Frost King has breathed on it," said Glossie, coming up, "and the surface is now as solid as ice." "Well, perhaps," said Klaus thoughtfully. "I might now carry my pack of toys to the children." "Is it a long journey?" asked Flossie. "Yes, it'll take me many days, for the pack is heavy," answered Klaus. "Then the snow would melt before you could get back," said the deer. "You must wait until spring, Klaus." Klaus sighed. "Had I your fleet feet," said he, "I could make the journey in a day." "But you have not," returned Glossie, looking at his own slender legs with pride. "Perhaps I could ride upon your back," Klaus ventured to remark after a pause. "Oh no, our backs are not strong enough to bear your weight," said Flossie decidedly. "But if you have a sleigh and could harness us to it, we might draw you easily, and your pack as well." "Well, I'll make a sleigh," exclaimed Klaus. "Will you agree to draw me if I do?" "Well," replied Flossie, "we must first go and ask the Knooks, who are our guardians, for permission. But if they consent, and you can make a sleigh and harness, we will gladly assist you." "Then go at once," cried Klaus eagerly. "I am sure the friendly Knooks will give their consent, and by the time you are back, I shall be ready to harness you to my sleigh." Flossie and Glossie, being the deer of much intelligence, had long wished to see the great world, so they gladly ran over the frozen snow to ask the Knooks if they might carry Klaus on his journey. Meantime, the toy maker hurriedly began the construction of a sleigh, using material from his woodpile. He made 2 long runners that turned upward at the front ends, and across these nailed short boards to make a platform. It was soon completed, but was as rude in appearance as it was possible for a sleigh to be. The harness was more difficult to prepare, but Klaus twisted cords together and knotted them so they would fit around the necks of the deer in the shape of a collar. From these ran other cords to fasten the deer to the front of the sleigh. Before the work was completed, Glossie and Flossie were back from the forest, having been granted permission by Will Nook to make the journey with Klaus, provided they would return to Burzee by daybreak the next morning. "That's not a very long time," said Flossie, "but we are swift and strong, and if we get started by this evening, we can travel many miles during the night." "Are you ready?" Klaus seated himself upon the stool, placed the stack of toys at his feet, and then gathered up the reins. "All ready," he shouted, "and away we go." The deer leaned forward, lifted their slender limbs, and the next moment, away flew the sleigh over the frozen snow. The swiftness of the motion surprised Klaus, for in a few strides they were across the valley and gliding over the broad plain beyond. The day had melted into evening by the time they started, for swiftly as Klaus had worked, many hours had been consumed in making his preparations. But the moon shone brightly to light their way, and Klaus soon decided it was just as pleasant to travel by night as by day. Away and away they sped, on and on over the hills and through the valleys and across the plains, flying across the sky with a sleigh filled with all the handmade gifts that Klaus had created himself. And that is just how Klaus and the sleigh and the reindeer took their first of many journeys to come, traveling across the winter sky, bringing happiness and hope to all the children. Klaus and his reindeer landed in a village where they had never been before, and a new difficulty now presented itself, for the people had locked their doors when they went to bed, and Klaus found he could not enter the houses to leave his toys. "I am afraid, my friends, we have made our journey for nothing," said he, "for I shall be obliged to carry my playthings back home again without giving them to the children of this village." "What's the matter?" asked Flossie. "The doors are locked," answered Klaus, "and I cannot get in." Glossie looked around at the houses. The snow was quite deep in that village, and just before them was a roof only a few feet above the sleigh. A broad chimney, which seemed to Glossie's big enough to admit Klaus, was at the peak of the roof. "Why don't you climb down that chimney?" asked Glossie. Klaus looked at it. "That would be easy enough if I were on top of the roof," he answered. "Then hold fast, and we will take you there," said the deer, and they gave one bound to the roof and landed beside the big chimney. "Good," cried Klaus, well pleased, and he slung the pack of toys over his shoulder and got into the chimney. There was plenty of soot on the bricks, but he did not mind that, and by placing his hands and knees against the sides, he crept downward until he had reached the fireplace. Leaping lightly over the smoldering coals, he found himself in a large sitting room where a dim light was burning. From this room, 2 doorways led into smaller chambers. In one, a woman lay asleep with a baby beside her in a crib. Klaus laughed, but he did not laugh aloud for fear of waking the baby. Then he slipped a big doll from his pack and laid it in the crib. And Klaus crept softly from the room and entered at the other doorway. Here were two boys fast asleep. Klaus gazed at them lovingly, and then placed upon the bed a drum, 2 horns, and a wooden elephant. He did not linger now that his work in this house was done, but climbed the chimney again and seated himself on his sleigh. "Can you find another chimney?" he asked the reindeer. "Easily enough," replied Glossie and Flossie. Down to the edge of the roof they raced, and then, without pausing, leaped through the air to the top of the next building, where a huge old-fashioned chimney stood. "Don't be so long this time," called Flossie, "or we shall never get back to the forest by daybreak." Klaus made a trip down this chimney also, and found 5 children sleeping in the house, all of whom were quickly supplied with toys. When he had climbed down the chimneys of all the houses in that village, and had left a toy for every sleeping child, Klaus found that his great sack was not yet half emptied. "Onward, friends," he called to the deer, "we must seek another village." So away they dashed, although it was long past midnight, and in a surprisingly short time they came to a large city, the largest Klaus had ever visited since he began to make toys. But he was not daunted by the throng of houses. He set to work at once, and his beautiful steeds carried him rapidly from one roof to another, only the highest being beyond the leaps of the agile deer. At last, the supply of toys was exhausted, and Klaus seated himself in the sleigh with the empty sack at his feet and turned the heads of Glossie and Flossie towards home. Presently Flossie asked, "What is that gray streak in the sky?" "It is the coming of the dawn of the day," answered Klaus, surprised to find that it was so late. "Good gracious," exclaimed Glossie, "then we shall not be home by daybreak, and the Knooks will punish us and never let us come again. We must race for the Laughing Valley and make our best speed," returned Flossie. "So hold fast, friend Klaus." Klaus held fast, and the next moment was flying so swiftly over the snow that he could not see the trees as they whirled past. Uphill and down dale, swift as an arrow shot from a bow, they dashed. And Klaus shut his eyes to keep the wind out of them and let the deer to find their own way. Finally, the sled came to a sudden stop, and Klaus, who was taken unawares, tumbled from his seat into a snowdrift. The sleigh had come to a stop in the Laughing Valley, only a few feet from the front door. In the east, the day was breaking, and turning to the edge of Burzee, he saw Glossie and Flossie just disappearing into the forest. Klaus thought that none of the children would ever know where the toys came from when they found them by their bedsides upon wakening the following morning. But kindly deeds are sure to bring fame, and fame has many wings to carry its tidings into far lands. So for miles and miles in every direction, people were talking of Klaus and his wonderful gifts to children. The sweet generousness of his work caused a few selfish folk to sneer, but even these were forced to admit their respect for a man so gentle-natured that he loved to devote his life to pleasing the helpless little ones of his race. Therefore, the inhabitants of every city and village had been eagerly watching the coming of Klaus, and remarkable stories of his beautiful playthings were told. When on the morning following the first trip of Klaus with his deer, the little ones came running to their parents with the pretty toys they had found, and asked from whence they came. And there was just one reply to this question. The good Klaus must have come here, my darlings, for his are the only toys in all the world. But how did he get in? Asked the children. At this, the fathers shook their heads, being themselves unable to understand how Klaus had gained admittance to their homes. But the mothers, watching the glad faces of their dear ones, whispered that the good Klaus was no mortal man, but assuredly a saint, and they piously blessed his name for the happiness he had bestowed upon their children. A saint, said one with bowed head, has no need to unlock doors if it pleases him to enter our homes. And afterward, when a child was naughty or disobedient, its mother would say, "You must pray to the good Santa Claus for forgiveness. He does not like naughty children, and unless you respect, he will bring you no more pretty toys." But Santa Claus himself would not have approved this speech. He brought toys to the children because they were little and because he loved them. He knew that the best of children were sometimes naughty. It is the way with children the world over, and he would not have changed their natures had he possessed the power to do so. And that is how Claus became Santa Claus. One night, Klaus decided to travel in another direction. He told his reindeer, "We shall find children I have never yet visited, and we must travel fast and work quickly, for my sack is full of toys and running over the brim." So just as the moon arose, they dashed out of the Laughing Valley and across the plain and over the hills to the south. The air was sharp and frosty, and the starlight touched the snowflakes and made them glitter like countless diamonds. The reindeer leaped onward with strong, steady bounds, and Klaus's heart was so light and merry that he laughed and sang while the wind whistled past his ears. The mother owls heard him as he passed near a wood and stuck their heads out of the hollow places in the tree trunks. But when they saw who it was, they whispered to the owlets nestling near them that it was only Santa Claus carrying toys to the children. It's strange how much those mother owls know. Klaus stopped at some of the scattered farmhouses and climbed down the chimneys to leave presents for the babies. Then away he went, signing his joyous carol. Now away we go o'er the gleaming snow, while the deer run swift and free. For to girls and boys we carry the toys that will fill their hearts with glee. The deer liked the sound of his deep bass voice and kept time to the song with their hoofbeats on the hard snow. But soon they stopped at another chimney, and Santa Claus, with sparkling eyes and face brushed red by the wind, climbed down its smoky sides and left a present for every child the house contained. It was a merry, happy night, Swiftly the deer ran, and busily their driver worked to scatter his gifts among the sleeping children. And when he returned home, Klaus was so wearied with his night's work that he threw himself upon his bed and fell into a deep slumber. And while he slept, the Christmas sun appeared in the sky and shone upon hundreds of happy homes, where the sound of childish laughter proclaimed that Santa Claus had made them a visit. It was his first Christmas Eve, and for hundreds of years since then, he has nobly fulfilled his mission to bring happiness to the hearts of little children. When you remember that no child until Santa Claus began his travels had ever known the pleasure of possessing a toy, you will understand how joy crept into the homes of those who had been favored with a visit from the good man, and how they talked of him day by day in loving tones and were honestly grateful for his kindly deeds. It is true that great warriors and mighty kings and clever scholars of that day were often spoken of by the people, but no one of them was so greatly beloved as Santa Claus, because none other was so unselfish as to devote himself to making others happy. For a generous deed lives longer than a great battle or a king's decree of a scholar's essay, because it spreads and leaves its mark on all nature and endures through many generations. As Klaus continued his Christmas deliveries, he realized he needed a new sleigh. He spent 1 year building it, and when it was finally done, he realized he also needed to add more deer to his team. And before he knew it, there was a team of 10 reindeer. When another Christmas Eve drew near, there was a monster load of beautiful gifts for the children. A big sleigh with plenty of reindeer to carry them. Klaus filled 3 sacks to the brim and tucked every corner of the sleigh box full of toys. Then at twilight, the 10 reindeer appeared, and Flossie introduced them all to Klaus. They were Racer and Pacer, Reckless and Speckless, Fearless and Peerless, and Ready and Steady, who, with Glossie and Flossie, made up the 10 who have traversed the world these hundreds of years with their generous master. They were all exceedingly beautiful, with slender limbs, spreading antlers, velvety dark eyes, and smooth coats of fawn color spotted with white. Klaus loved them at once and has loved them ever since, for they are loyal friends and have rendered him priceless service. The new harness fitted them nicely, and soon they were all fastened to the sleigh by twos, with Glossie and Flossie in the lead. They wore the strings of sleigh bells, and were so delighted with the music they made, they kept prancing up and down to make the bells ring. Klaus now seated himself in the sleigh, drew a warm robe over his knees and his fur cap over his ears, and cracked his long whip as a signal to start. Instantly the 10 leaped forward and were away like the wind, while jolly Klaus laughed gleefully to see them run. He shouted a song in his big, hearty voice. Now away we go o'er the frozen snow, as merry as we can be. There are many joys in our load of toys, as many a child will know. We'll scatter them wide on our wild night ride o'er the crisp and sparkling snow. Now it was on the same Christmas Eve that little Margot and her brother Dick and her cousins, Ned and Sarah, were visiting Margot at her house. They came in from making a snowman with their clothes damp, their mittens dripping, and their shoes and stockings wet through and through. They were not scolded, for Margot's mother knew the snow was melting. But they were sent early to bed that their clothes might be hung over chairs to dry. The shoes were placed on the red tiles of the hearth, where the heat from the hot embers would strike them. And the stockings were carefully hung in a row by the chimney, directly over the fireplace. That was the reason Santa Claus noticed them when he came down the chimney that night, and all the household was fast asleep. He was in a tremendous hurry, and seeing the stockings all belonged to children, he quickly stuffed his toys into them and dashed up the chimney again. Appearing on the roof so suddenly that the reindeer were astonished at his agility. I wish they would all hang up their stockings, he thought, as he drove to the next chimney. It would save me a lot of time, and I could then visit more children before daybreak. When Margot and Dick and Ned and Sarah jumped out of bed next morning and ran downstairs to get their stockings from the fireplace, they were filled with delight to find the toys from Santa Claus inside them. I think they found more presents in their stockings than any other children of that city had received, for Santa was in a hurry and did not stop to count the toys. Of course, they told all their little friends about it, and of course, every one of them decided to hang his own stockings by the fireplace the next Christmas Eve. Even Bessie Blithesome, who made a visit to that city with her father, the great Lord of Lord, heard the story from the children and hung their own pretty stockings by the chimney when she returned home at Christmas time. On his next trip, Santa Claus found so many stockings hung up in anticipation of his visit that he could fill them in a jiffy, and then away again in half the time required to hunt the children up, he would place the toys by their bedside. The custom grew year after year and has always been a great help to Santa Claus. And with so many children to visit, he surely needs all the help we are able to give him. Klaus had always kept his promise to the Knooks by returning to the Laughing Valley by daybreak, but only the swiftness of his reindeer has enabled him to do this, for he travels over all the world. He loved his work, and he loved the brisk night ride on his sleigh and the tinkle of the sleigh bells. On that first trip with the 10 reindeer, only Glossie and Flossie wore bells. But each year thereafter, for 8 years, Klaus carried presents to the children of the Gnome King, and that good-natured monarch gave him in return a string of bells at each visit, so that finally every one of the 10 deer was supplied. And you may imagine what a merry tune the bells played as the sleigh sped over the snow. The children's stockings were so long that it required a great many toys to fill them. Soon Klaus found there were other things besides toys that children love. So he sent some of the fairies, who were always his good friends, into the tropics, from whence they returned with great bags full of oranges and bananas, which they had plucked from the trees. And other fairies flew to the wonderful valley of Funnyland, where delicious candies and bonbons grow thickly on the bushes, and returned laden with many boxes of sweetmeats for the little ones. These things Santa Claus, on each Christmas Eve, placed in the long stockings, together with his toys, and the children were glad to get them, you may be sure. Once, just as the reindeer were ready to start on their yearly trip, a fairy came to Claus and told him of 3 little children who lived beneath a rude tent of skins on a broad plain where there were no trees whatever. These poor babies were miserable and unhappy, for their parents were ignorant people who neglected them sadly. Klaus resolved to visit these children before he returned home, and during his ride, he picked up the bushy top of a pine tree, which the wind had broken off, and placed it in his sleigh. It was nearly morning when the deer stopped before the lonely tent of skins, where the poor children lay asleep. Klaus at once planted the bit of pine tree in the sand and stuck many candles on the branches. He hung some of his prettiest toys on the tree, as well as several bags of candles. It did not take long to do all of this, for Santa Claus works quickly. And when all was ready, he lit the candles, and thrusting his head at the opening of the tent, he shouted, "Merry Christmas, little ones!" And with that, he leaped into his sleigh and was out of sight before the children, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, would come out to see who had called them. You can imagine the wonder and joy of those little ones who had never in their lives known a real pleasure before. When they saw the tree sparkling with lights that shone brilliant in the gray dawn, and hung with toys enough to make them happy for years to come, they joined hands and danced around the tree, shouting and laughing until they were obliged to pause for breath. And their parents also came out to look and wonder, and thereafter had more respect and consideration for their children, since Santa Claus had honored them with such beautiful gifts. The idea of the Christmas tree pleased Klaus, and so the following year he carried many of them in his sleigh and put them up in the homes of poor people who seldom saw trees, and placed candles and toys on the branches. Of course, he could not carry enough trees in one load of all who wanted them, but in some homes, the fathers were able to get trees and have them all ready for Santa Claus when he arrived. And these the good Klaus always decorated as prettily as possible. He hung with toys enough for all the children who came to see the tree lit. These novel ideas and the generous manner in which they were carried out made the children long for that one night in the year when their friend, Santa Claus, should visit them. And as much anticipation as very pleasant and comforting, the little ones gleaned much happiness by wondering what would happen when Santa Claus next arrived. For many years he carried on this noble work, for the simple, hard-working life he had led gave him perfect health and strength. And doubtless a man can live longer in the beautiful Laughing Valley, where there are no cares and everything is peaceful and merry, than in any other part of the world. But when many years had rolled away, Santa Claus grew old. The long beard of golden brown that once covered his cheeks and chin gradually became gray and finally turned to pure white. His hair was white too, and there were wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, which showed plainly when he laughed. But in spite of these things, he remained as lively as ever, and was jolly, with his kind eyes sparkling brightly as they did the first day when he came to the Laughing Valley. Yet a time is sure to come when every mortal who has grown old and lived his life is required to leave this world for another. So it's no wonder that after Santa Claus had driven his reindeer on many a Christmas Eve, those staunch friends finally whispered among themselves that they had probably drawn his sleigh for the last time. But King Ak decided to bestow upon Klaus the mantle of immortality, calling him the patron saint of children. And the mantle, it became a part of his being, and neither mortal nor immortal could ever take it from him. And the red blood of everlasting life coursed swiftly through his veins. The next morning, when Santa Claus opened his eyes and gazed around the familiar room, which he had feared he might never see again, he was astonished to find his old strength renewed and to feel the red blood of perfect health coursing through his veins. He sprang from his bed and stood where the bright sunshine came in through his window and flooded it with its merry dancing rays. He did not then understand what had happened to restore him the vigor of youth. But in spite of the fact that his beard remained the color of snow and his wrinkles still lingered in the corners of his bright eyes, old Santa Claus felt as brisk and merry as a boy of 16. And he was soon whistling contentedly as he busied himself fashioning new toys. Then Ak came to him and told of the mantle of immortality and how Klaus had won it through his love for little children. It made old Santa look grave for a moment to think that he had been so favored, but it also made him glad to realize that now he would never have to fear being parted from those dear ones. At once he began preparations for making a remarkable assortment of pretty and amusing playthings, and in larger quantities than ever before, for now he might always devote himself to this work. So he decided that no child in the world, poor or rich, should hereafter go without a Christmas gift if he could manage to supply it. The world was new in the days when dear old Santa Claus first began toy making and won by his loving deeds the mantle of immortality. And the task of supplying cheering words, sympathy, and pretty playthings to all the young of his race did not seem a difficult undertaking at all. Every year, more and more children were born into the world, and these, when they grew up, began spreading slowly over the face of the earth, seeking new homes. So Santa Claus found each year that his journeys must extend farther and farther from the Laughing Valley. and that the packs of toys must be made larger. After a few generations, it was remarkable how the number of people continued to grow, and how many more children there were every year to be served. When the people filled all the cities and lands of one country, they wandered into another part of the world. And the men cut down the trees in many of the great forests that had been ruled by Ak. And with the wood they built new cities. And where the forests had been were fields of grain and herds of browsing cattle. You might think the master woodsman would rebel at the loss of his forests, but not so. The wisdom of Ak was mighty and far-seeing. "The world was made for men," said he to Santa Claus, "and I have but guarded the forests until men needed them for their use. I'm glad my strong trees can furnish shelter for men's weak bodies and warm them through the cold winters. But I hope they will not cut down all the trees, for mankind needs the shelter of the woods in summer as much as the warmth of blazing logs in winter. And however crowded the world may grow, by and by people made ships from the tree trunks and crossed over oceans and built cities in far lands. The oceans made little difference to the journeys of Santa Claus. His reindeer sped over the waters as swiftly as over land, and his sleigh headed from east to west and followed in the wake of the sun. So as the earth rode slowly, Santa Claus had all of 24 hours to encircle it each Christmas Eve. And the speedy reindeer enjoyed these wonderful journeys more and more. So year after year, and generation after generation, and century after century, the world grew older, and the people became more numerous, and the labors of Santa Claus steadily increased. The fame of his good deeds spread to every household where children dwelt, and all the little ones loved him dearly, and the fathers and mothers honored him for the happiness he had given them when they too were young. And the aged grandsires and granddames remembered him with tender gratitude and blessed his name. And eventually, the fairies decided that Santa should take them on the next journey. They said, "We can come to one of those houses with stoves instead of fireplaces, and we can distribute the toys to the children without the need of using a chimney." Santa, wanting to reach more and more children, decided to lighten his task, and then he asked the parents to assist him. "Get your Christmas trees all ready for my coming," he said to them, "and then I shall be ready to leave the presents without loss of time. And you can put them on the trees when I'm gone." And to others he said, "See that the children's stockings are hung up in readiness for my coming, and then I can fill them as quick as a wink." And often when parents were kind and good-natured, Santa Claus would simply fling down his package of gifts and leave the fathers and mothers to fill the stockings after he had darted away in his sleigh. "I will make all loving parents my deputies," cried the jolly old fellow, "and they shall help me do my work. For in this way I shall save many precious minutes, and few children need be neglected for lack of time to visit them." Besides carrying around the big packs in his swift-flying sleigh, old Santa began to send great heaps of toys to the toy shops. so that if parents wanted larger supplies for their children, they could easily get them. And if any children were, by chance, missed by Santa Claus on his yearly rounds, they could go to the toy shops and get enough to make them happy and contented. And the toy shops also proved convenient whenever a child fell ill and needed a new toy to amuse it. And sometimes on birthdays, the fathers and mothers go to the toy shops and get pretty gifts for their children in honor of the happy event. Perhaps you will now understand how, in spite of the bigness of the world, Santa Claus is able to supply all the children with beautiful gifts. To be sure, the old gentleman is rarely seen in these days, but it is not because he tries to keep out of sight, I assure you. Santa Claus is the same loving friend of children that in the old days used to play and romp with them by the hour. And I know he would love to do the same now, if he had the time. But you see, he is so busy all the year making toys, and so hurried on that one night, when he visits our homes with his packs, he comes and goes among us like a flash, and it's almost impossible to catch a glimpse of him. And although there are millions and millions more children in the world than there used to be, Santa Claus has never been known to complain of their increasing numbers. The more the merrier, he cries with his jolly laugh. And the only difference to him is the fact that his little fairies have to make their busy fingers fly faster every year to satisfy the demands of so many little ones. In all this world, there is nothing so beautiful as a happy child, says good old Santa Claus. And if he had his way, the children would all be happy. And that's the end of our story. So I wish you now sweet dreams. Good night and happy holidays.